Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, dona nobis pacem.
Good morning. I'll warn you, I'm actually the most non-morning person in the entire world, so know that when I came this morning, it was out of love. A lot of love. Particularly when I woke up at 4. Let us begin with prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Good loving God, as we gather here this day, we ask that you enliven our hearts to reflect on this understanding of Christian manhood, that you help us to understand the person that you call us to be. You help us to reflect on those things that need to be part of our lives and strengthened, and those things that you call for us to cast out, to leave behind, that we may embrace our manhood, we may embrace our faith first and always. We ask this through the intercession of St. Joseph and through your Son, Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. So this is a nice topic, and I thought I was thinking and working on this and making adjustments last night, and I thought we would start with simply a moment of silence. I know, Hugo, you said there's some people who are... Number 3. There are some people who are streaming. I don't know if they're from New England or not, but this is a great moment. And every good presentation, I hope this will be a good presentation, deserves a dedication. So I thought we would dedicate this to Roger. If you're watching, Roger, this one's for you. I don't know if you could hear me booing at the TV last night when you presented Roger Kraft, and of course, let's just rest in the moment one more time. It was beautiful last night, isn't it? That's part of Christian manhood. I thought actually Tom Brady would be the person that I should have come present on that. I want to begin with a little story. There once was a woman who was in an airport, and if you've ever been in the airport when it's busy, you know, or around a delay, you know how crazy it can be. Not particularly in Manchester. It's always quiet in Manchester. But those cities that you connect in, like Atlanta and Chicago. There's a woman who was sitting in an airport, and one of her great loves traveled for business, an older woman, almost near retirement. One of her great loves was her Oreo cookies. I love Oreo cookies. You guys probably do too. I think a few of you do, at least. And she loved her Oreo cookies, and she sat down at the table in the food court. You know in an airport how the food court can get crowded? And you end up sitting, you're just happy to have a seat. Well, the older woman's sitting there, and there's a young man that sits down across from her, and the older woman's reading her newspaper. The young man's reading his iPhone, as so many young people do today, and just not even paying attention, and the cookies are on the table. And the older woman, who loves her Oreos, is surprised when suddenly the young man reaches to the middle of the table and opens the bag of cookies and eats one. And she's thinking to herself, as many can, what nerve. This young man is eating my cookies. So she thinks for a minute, and then a minute later she reaches across and she takes one. In her mind, she's still smiling. She doesn't want to be rude, but in her mind, she's like, I'll show him. She takes a cookie and she eats it. And the other man, young man, he responds and he eats one too. And you can see the steam coming out of the woman's ears. You know how women can be, and she's mad. She still smiles, though. Then a few minutes later, this goes back and forth, and finally there's one cookie left. The young man reaches the middle of the table. He pulls back the top. You know how the Oreo cookie covers are. And he snaps it in half. And he reaches across the table and he gives her half. And she's thinking, the nerve. She's mad. She takes it, does a little smile. You know the smile that sometimes when women are mad, you get the smile, like, and you're in trouble. And that's what he gets. And then the plane's called, and so she gathers up her newspaper and things, and she goes on Southwest Airlines. And how many of you have flown Southwest? You know how it is. Like, all the type A people, they have the A, and then if you're probably type B or C, you're there, and you get on, and all the middle seats are open, and everyone refuses to give eye contact with you because they don't want you to sit in the middle seat. You know what I'm talking about. The lady gets and finally finds a middle seat, and she sits down and puts her newspaper in the front, and she grabs her bag that she's going to stow away, and she opens it up for a minute. She's going to get her book that she's going to read. She opens it up. She realizes that there's a full bag of Oreo cookies in her bag. And the cookies that were being eaten weren't hers. They were his. Perspective matters. I think sometimes in things we think we see right as it is, because it's right in front of us. We think we understand everything. And it's only when we step back, sometimes what we know, or what we think we know, is not the case. And sometimes the reality that we can construct for ourselves is not a reality at all. One of the things that I think I want to draw our attention to, and this weekend's readings actually worked great for it, if you haven't given it thought. And I think it comes down to this notion of Christian manhood. It's the notion of pop Christianity as kind of placed out in the culture of our day. Now, obviously the culture of our day is not favorable to faith. But even when faith is talked about, it's rarely faith from a Catholic perspective that's in the general language of our culture. And even you look at many of the books we read are good books, but it's a limited difference when they're kind of putting out a notion of pop Christianity versus the gospel and versus Christian manhood. You say, well, Father, what are you talking about? Consider this. You can see it. Turn on Joel Osteen. I don't recommend that you do that. But he's a good preacher, isn't he? If you've ever heard him, he's pretty good. You turn to inspiration, some of these things, and you have these great storytellers and all of the rest. And you'll hear it in what they say. But you'll also hear it in the churches that pop up. We have some in Manchester that go from out of nowhere, and suddenly there's 1,000 people every weekend, or 2,000 people every weekend. I know we have one here. And it's amazing. People that sometimes even lead may not even have a background in knowledge of theology, but they become popular. And if you listen carefully, some could disagree with me, but if you listen carefully, the conversation about faith begins and ends with me. The reason I say that, and some here may disagree with me, I think this weekend's gospel wouldn't. The conversation always begins and ends with my personal relationship with Jesus Christ. It's important that we have a strong personal relationship with Jesus Christ. So I don't want anyone here to think that I'm saying that's not something we want to aspire to. But consider what happens when the large focus of one's faith development begins and ends with me. My. Because then the focus is about what I experience. Then the focus is about what I want, what I get. Now, in one point, we can't ignore that because we have real needs, and the Lord wants to provide for those needs. But if the conversation always begins and ends with me, then it's not a conversation that begins and ends with the Lord. And I think that difference is easy to gloss over. But even think about the nature of the Lord himself. What is the full nature of God? His self-emptying love. That's the fullness that Jesus shows us, is he gives fully of himself to others. The conversation doesn't begin and end with me. Our conversation shouldn't begin and end with me. We've heard the gospel this weekend. It's a perfect timing. I was excited when I saw the timing come together. The gospel yesterday talked about, it's Matthew 5:13 through 16. The gospel yesterday talked about the salt and the light. You're the light of the world, the salt of the earth, and talks about the city on the hill. And if you know, you pay attention, you've heard these readings over and over and over again. You know that the point that Jesus is making is that when it comes to our experience of faith and our faith itself, it is not meant to be understood purely from a personal perspective. The light of Christ that's in all of us isn't meant just to shine on us and we rest in the light like I'm in these spotlights right here. That the very end of faith, the end of Christian faith, the end of faith in Christ, is for that light to shine and illuminate the world and those around us. And I think so much of the conversation in what I call pop Christianity is simply about illuminating us. And it takes away that sense of illuminating the world. And so, Father, well, certainly we need the light of Christ to illuminate us, because there's darkness. And in each of us, the sins that we wrestle with, the sins that we need the light of Christ to shine on, and that kind of, I think that manly virtue of we have to step up to the plate and confront things in our lives, that's real. Absolutely. But the part of Christian manhood that I think has been attacked in our culture is the part of service. The part of our manhood and in a particular way that men are called to serve. Women are called to serve too. That's a whole other talk. I'll give a different talk to the women's group if they invite me. But in a particular way, part of our nature as men is to serve, to protect. It's a reason that, remember, I was at church my first Sunday in Berlin. There was someone that came in, and I won't give too many details because I want to respect their privacy. But a gentleman had come in and came in the front of the church, and Father Kyle Stanton, who was the pastor, and I was his associate, we knew who the person was. And we knew the person struggled with some illnesses. So we knew it would be okay. But we knew it wasn't going to be a beginning of the Mass. It's my first weekend there, Father Kyle's first weekend as pastor. And a gentleman walks in the front of the church and starts yelling and talking to him and saying all of this stuff. We know it's going to be okay. But there's this sudden, like, what's about to happen? You get worried. We see the news and you get worried about, is this someone going to get hurt? You don't know. Instinctively as men, when I looked out at the congregation, two things came to my mind. I was an associate. The first thing that came to my mind was, thank God I'm not the pastor. I don't have to deal with this. He does. And I just kind of sat there and said, have fun. The person came up and was yelling and talking and all of the rest. But I looked out at the congregation. You know what I saw? Instinctively, about 15 or 20 wives grabbed their husbands' arms because the husbands were about to stand up and go take care of business. That's instinctive in our manhood. To act, to want to be engaged. It's that sense that we don't simply live for ourselves. There's not that passivity. That's something that God gives us. And how that's understood in a Christian perspective is different than how it's understood in other perspectives. But I bring that first mention of the vision of pop Christianity versus a vision of the gospel. If our conversation is only about us, or largely is about us and only our experience, and it's important to reflect on that, we need to be careful that we're paying attention to what Jesus calls us to. And Jesus calls us to look out. Jesus calls for the light of Christ to so shine on those around us. The early church fathers had this great vision. And they said, our call in life is to be like the moon. Perhaps you've heard this before. We are called to be the moon to the world. You say, well, that's kind of strange. We're called to be the moon to the world that reflects the light of Christ, reflects the light of the sun. Isn't that a beautiful image? The light of the moon there's no light in the moon. It's the sun's light that the moon reflects. And we know that the moon can shine down on a full moon. It can shine down and illuminate the night, the darkness. In many ways, that's the thing. It's not about the moon. It's not about that planet. It's about the sun and the light of the sun, which the moon reflects. I like stories. I don't know if you guys do. There's a great story. You want a good book? I'm going to show you. This is a large, I'm going to put up a slide for a book. It tells us one particular story in a real way. You want a good book. It's not a spiritual reading book. But if you want a man's man book, you like history. Roger Crowley has this book called Empires of the Sea. Now, I'll be honest with you. I'll just give you a little disclosure. I like to read, but I don't like to read. So I have a whole library of books that I've started, thought about reading, but haven't read. And then I have a little library of books, as soon as I picked it up and I'm a chapter in, you can't put it down. Roger Crowley has this great book. It's not a spiritual reading book, but I think if we look at it from a man's perspective and you step back, it certainly could be one that you could reflect on. It's called The Empires of the Sea, the Siege of Malta, the Battle of Lepanto, and the contest for the center of the world. And it tells the story in the 16th century of this great struggle. And the struggle is between the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim world, and the Christian world. And the Christian world is divided. It's divided over money. It's divided over power. It's this squabbling world. And then there's this great force that's united and is beginning its conquest. Some of these are my notes to myself, but that's okay, so I don't forget. There's this great struggle. And as the Christian world is all divided, what's happening? All of these forces are marching in, and they're beginning to pick off one at a time. The Christian world looks up and says, this is terrible, and then they keep fighting amongst themselves. And there's this great story, a true story of the battle for Malta. If you don't know where Malta is, it's just above North Africa, or go to Sicily and take left. It's been fought over for thousands of years. And today it remains the most Catholic country in the world. In fact, there are priests, so many priests in Malta that they have to live at home with mom. I'm not making that up. So all priests live at home except for those in a religious order. What happens is the Ottoman Empire, the Muslims are conquering Europe. And the real question is, will Europe fall? And it's a real question. And what happens is these two tiny, tiny, tiny islands in the middle of the Mediterranean. One day the Maltese wake up and there's the island of Malta and the island of Gozo. And one day they wake up and they discover that literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Ottoman Turks, Muslims, have come in and they kidnapped everyone on the island of Gozo. They're gone. And then the next year later, whatever, months later, the people in Malta itself wake up and they look out from the castle of the fort walls of what today is Valletta, but wasn't called then Valletta. And they look out and there's 50 to 100,000 Muslim Ottoman Turks in front of their castle, in front of their walls. And then they look around the city and there's 500 Maltese knights. And they look back out at almost 100,000 soldiers who are there to conquer them. And they look around and they have 500 of the last knights of Malta, men who dedicated their lives to fighting for the faith, fighting with chivalry, with manhood, with all of these things. People who today care for the poor and the sick. This great Christian order of prayer, of faith, and being willing to step up to the plate and defend it. And these 500 knights wake up, and suddenly they're under siege. And what happens in that story that's told in that book, I'm serious, you want a good book, buy the book. I should be Roger Crowley's spokesman. Over the course of months, or course of perhaps a year, it's been a while since I read the book, but the story sticks with you. There's 130,000 cannonballs that are shot at them. At one point they wake up And they've brought in tens of thousands of miners from the Balkans, and they literally mine underneath the fort. And they blow up with a mine inside. And somehow, remarkably, these 500 Maltese knights, some random people that kind of come into the story, who are outnumbered 100, 500, whatever it is, to 1, they hold out. They literally put like pumpkins on and put, helmets on the walls. And what happens is every time they're attacked and the walls are about to breach, they run forward. They spend the nights in vigil. And you have this amazing story when all the rest of the world negated, all of the rest of the Christian world failed in their responsibility. 500 men and some others who were there, but largely 500 men held the line. And they won. And the Ottomans left. The politicians failed. But the two things that didn't fail was the faith of the knights and the people in Malta, and their resolve and their willingness to step up to the plate. I think that's an important story. It's R300 if you've seen the movie. They were outnumbered, they were outgunned, they were surrounded, and the world was on the brink. Now step aside from that example for a minute. How different is that than, in some sense, metaphorical sense, with what we're up against? We're outnumbered. We're outgunned. And everyone else wonders if we should throw in the towel, or many wonder. The question is, do we have the same manhood and faith as a Maltese knight? And what's the lasting impact? The lasting impact of their willingness to stay and fight is the reality that Christian Europe was saved. Faces the same challenges again today, but in a different way. So the question is, what is Christian manhood and what are we up against? Now, the what are we up against, I think we know. C.S. Lewis uses this image, and perhaps some of your other speakers have mentioned it. C.S. Lewis, when asked about Christian manhood, or when describing the faith of men in particular, uses the image of knighthood. And he says, if you think about it, what is our understanding of knighthood? Christian knighthood always had two kind of competing themes. One is resolve and strength, and the other is gentleness. That draw between being strong and courageous and willing to fight, and that other part of willing to care and willing to love and recognizing those. Lewis said that the challenge is not to let either of those go without a balance. We know that fierceness without a balance, you become a bully, a brute. And we know that gentleness without truth, without balancing factors, runs away in the other direction. And the importance, I think, of that image is real. If you think of the Lord himself, he balances that. On one hand, Jesus is willing to flip the money changer's table in the temple. Right? That's not like the images in the last 30 years of Jesus have always been like, I call them like kittens and puppies Jesus, that just is all love, which God is love, the fullness of love. But we also know the fullness of love is truth. And sometimes people will speak to love, but fail to speak to truth. You see it in parenting today. How many parents will speak only to love and never to truth? That's the hard part of love, truth. The easy part of love is, not easy, but is just being present. The hard part of love is speaking the truth when no one wants to hear it, or those who want to hear it might not react well when you tell them. I'm going to go back for a second, if I can figure out how to do it. So Jesus flipping the tables in the money temple. And then you have the other image of Jesus. You have Jesus healing in gentleness and kindness. But think of Jesus at the death of his friend Lazarus. He cries. Jesus, who is strong, is gentle. Jesus who is willing to speak the truth, and even if it enrages the crowd around him, although he speaks truth with charity, is gentle. He's not too manly to be willing to show his love. That dichotomy, that competing strands, I think, is important. Compare that then with when we know that manhood, Christian manhood in particular, is under assault. Consider what we see in culture. What are the images that are held up of manhood? We know that the culture is against us. I think there's no way around that. But we shouldn't be so lost in fighting the culture that we ignore the other part, which is ourselves. But you see the images. The images of manhood that are presented in the media, many are not bad in all ways. They're not fully the manhood that we would see. I ask this question. When's the last time you've seen a television show that shows a strong man in the family? You think about that. When do you see strong men on television? Single men. You see shows like Law and Order. Now look back and think back to the image C.S. Lewis gives. You think back to the Knights. What is the categories we look at? Well, certainly, let's start with passions. That's a part of manhood. We can't pretend it's not. I hear confessions. It's a big part of manhood, and that men have to come to understand. But what's the knighthood's version of that? What the knighthood says is that it's about love, not lust. This image of male sexuality that's about conquest, that's in our culture, is not what Christian manhood's about. It's about balance. We shine that light of Christ on those around us. We also need to look in. We can't ignore that. I said that before. That's a real challenge. The image of knighthood of protecting family. Not just going to fight, but fighting to protect family. I would say this example. If you were walking out in the parking lot today, or you got home and you found out someone had stolen tens of thousands of dollars from you, or from me, all of us in this room would react, I would imagine, strongly. We'd pursue that. Yet I think sometimes what happens is when people steal things closer to our heart and more dear, like the faith of our children, or anything that's close to our heart, what happens is sometimes we don't fight as hard because the enemy isn't as clear. Provide and care for others. And faith and duty. Those are the images of manhood. Those are the realities of manhood that we're called to lift up. And then there's the lies and the challenges. Think about it. This is what I see in the confessional. This is what I see in ministry. If it happens online, it doesn't count. Yes, it does. Like, that's a reality of manhood. Lust is okay. Love is simply about romance. No, love is not just about romance. Love isn't about romance when you have to get up in the morning and go to work. Love is not about romance in many of the difficult times in life, as you know. What I would say to Christian men is two things. First, look in the mirror. Because it's easy to want to fight the cultural war. That's good. That's part of our manhood. But often the war we don't fight is inside. We don't go to war against those things that we don't want in our lives. I've often said in the confessional, I said to people, do you love your iPhone more than your soul? iPhones aren't inherently bad, but many people allow their iPhones to take them to bad places. Do you love your computer more than your soul? Are you willing to do something about it? Because if ISIS was outside the door today, all of us would pick up whatever we could find and we'd go fight. But when the devil's at the door of our heart and tempting in the many ways of lust that all men face, sometimes we don't pick up anything to go fight. We simply say, I'll try harder next time. Are we so committed to the fight that we're willing to make the changes we don't want to make? That's the question I always ask, and it's the question I ask myself. What's the lies when protecting and providing for family? The easy fight, and it's not easy, I know, is to provide, to be present, and financially. The hard fight for any family, for any man, is to be present in the ways that matter. I can't tell you how many men I've seen as a teacher who aren't fully present to their families, and they choose providing for their families over being present, when in reality, it's the other way around that's the most important. The lies our culture tells us that it's just about me. You know what the motto of so many of our Jesuit high schools in the United States? Men for others. Isn't that the essence of Christian manhood? Men for Christ and men for others. We live in a world that's about men for self. That's obsessed with how we look, all of those things. Gone is that faith and duty part. And I think we should reflect on that on our own. I mean, isn't that the great image? There's a great tradition. I don't know if it still happens, but it happened when I was a seminarian at St. Aloysius of Gonzaga Parish in Nashua, among the Mexican community. Well, I think it was monthly. The men in the community would come to the church with their sons, and they'd keep an all-night vigil once a month. And so they would pray all night through the night, and they'd go in shifts, and it would be the fathers and sons. And the fathers and sons would gather around, and they'd eat and watch cookie, and then it's different people would be in vigil. And then they'd all go up and they'd pray from the middle of the night all the way through the morning. I thought, what an image of faith and duty. What an image of sacrifice. The other part is, I think that pop Christianity can make us want every moment of prayer to be profound. Every moment of prayer isn't, as you know. But what is profound is faithfulness, is fidelity. That's a virtue gone in the world in which we live. You think about it. How willing are people today to break commitments? People will break commitments for anything. Fidelity is much different. Now, I won't lie to you. I thought about breaking commitments this morning at 4 a.m. Last night after. Looking at the clock, I'll just touch on a couple things to end us. I think one of the things that we all know and we all expect, and I think Hugo asked me to talk on, and I talked too long, so we miss it, is Christian persecution. We know it's coming. But I'm going to let you know we have a harder job, a harder battle than in many parts of the world, at least as men. In some sense, the easier battle is the one you know where it is, where there's the people with the guns and the weapons outside. The harder battle is the whispers of the mind that lead hearts away. And that's the battle we face. It's a great story up at St. Anselm College. Joseph Rummel went there about 100 years ago. And he went to St. Anselm, and then his story goes on. He was nothing special by any account. And then he went and eventually became the Archbishop of New Orleans. So I guess he was special, right? Man of faith. Anyone know this story? He became the Archbishop of New Orleans in the 50s, or 40s, and then was through the 50s. And at that time, he looked around his church and it was segregated between black and white. And he looked around and he had his moment where he stepped up to the plate. And a decade and a half before the politicians did anything, Archbishop Joseph Rummel, who went to school just 2 miles from here, went to the pulpit of his cathedral and he said, in Louisiana in the 1950s, and said, the kingdom of God is not segregated between black or white, and neither will my church or my schools be. And he threw the hammer down. People walked out. Everywhere went, people disrupted his masses. You know what the politicians did? I bet you can guess. They said, you should leave your faith outside of how we live our cultural life. And you know what he said to the politicians, to the people who led the protests? This is what the church believes. And if you're not with it, you're not with the Lord. Don't come. You're outside, excommunicated. Bam. He threw down the hammer. You know what happened? He desegregated the second largest school district in the country overnight, long before the politicians had the courage or the knowledge. But he stepped up to the plate and was a man. He knew his faith. He saw where the battle was, and he was willing to go and fight it. Our battle is, in many ways, a harder one, because we don't have pulpits to step up to. We might not even have the people there to listen to us. But we can be like those 500 men who held the line. Now that the bell's ringing, I realize the last quarter of my presentation won't get through. But I'll tell you, we'll do it in 30 seconds or less. What is it that we need to do? 1, reject passivity. This is our enemy. Where we sit there and we sit back and we don't act. Reject passivity. It's different in each of our lives and our families, but we cannot simply sit back and watch. Accept responsibility. That's not only for the outside world, but for the inside world. Accept responsibility. Part of manhood Christian manhood is stepping up and knowing the truth of Christ. And that's accepting responsibility in our own lives in a real way and say, this has got to go. And this is what I need to do. Lead courageously. The key word isn't courage, the key word is lead. Lead. As men, we've stepped back from leading in our homes, in our communities, even in our churches. Trust that God will do good things. That's the reality, because He will. We can't be so focused on what the persecution will be or what we're up against. We've got to stay focused on what the fight is. And that's where we need to be. What are the questions I leave you with? Where have you experienced society's attack on Christian manhood? And how do we fight back? You can pick some, you may not be able to do all of these. Where in your own life is God calling you to knighthood? And specifically to more strength and tenderness. Don't lose the second part for those who are married. Don't lose the second part. Your wife is your wife. She's not a man. Like a men, we think, hey, as long as I'm with you, as long as we're in the same room together, that means I like you. Women don't think that way. We need to remember that. What does duty and honor mean in the life of the church? And where can we be better examples? What's the inner battle the Lord's preparing you for? Because that's a battle you have to fight first. And where will evil attack your life first? And how will you respond? Because anytime you're willing to go into battle in Christian manhood and step up to the plate, you got to know that Satan's going to battle too. But the difference between Satan and Christ is Christ always conquers. I turn it over to all of you for your small group discussion, because I think I'm a couple minutes over.
Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, dona